It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're drifting into the underdeck shadows of the most famous ship never to finish its journey. Not the iceberg part, no, not yet. This is about everything that happened before the water touched the wood. The boredom, the smells, the silence of class, the kind of invisible discomfort that doesn't make it into movies. Because if you had been there, really there, you might not have lasted a day. If you enjoy stories like this, soft and a little haunting, you're welcome to stay a while. Maybe even subscribe, but only if it feels like home. Let me know where you're listening from, or what time it is. Now, dim the lights, and let's drift back in time to a ship that hadn't sunk yet. There's a strange kind of silence that lives in expensive places. It's not the quiet of peace, or stillness, or contentment. It's the hush of performance. A velvet muffled pressure to appear pleased, clean, composed. That was the air you walked through when you stepped into the grand staircase on the RMS Titanic. Not luxury, exactly, but the performance of luxury. Gold-trimmed ceilings, wrought iron scrollwork, would carve to within an inch of its breadth. All of it borrowed from a French chateau that never floated, and all of it oddly sterile. It smelled faintly of polished oak, coal smoke, and something chemical, formaldehyde maybe, or paint that hadn't quite dried. The kind of air that made your skin feel overdressed and underloved. It's easy to forget that the Titanic was brand new, not seasoned by time or softened by wear. Everything was too stiff, too symmetrical, too ... intentional. The plates were pristine, but the cutlery clinked in that uncertain way that says, "We've never been used before." And the people, they knew they were being watched. Watched by the crew, watched by the world, watched by one another. First class was a hall of mirrors in lace and tails, each passenger measuring their value by glances and gossip. The air wasn't just recycled, was curated, filtered through velvet ropes and social codes so precise they might as well have been embroidered on the napkins. And here's the quiet horror no one talks about. It was exhausting. You, 21st century soul that you are, might not have lasted a single dinner service. Your shoes would have pinched. Your collar would have choked. Your smile, meant to be polite, might have read as gauche. You wouldn't know how to ask for salt without implying you thought the food needed it. You'd be wrong before you even sat down. There was a menu for everything, a proper direction to stir your tea. Even boredom came with rules. Yes, there was music. A string quartet played as you floated down that grand oak staircase, and they were good. Too good, maybe. The kind of practiced that doesn't miss a note but forgets why the music hurts. And still, the silence lingered. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if you belong, or worse, if you ever did. If you had wandered away from the gleam of the staircase, just a little past the embroidered carpets and the hushed conversation about stocks and train routes, you might have found yourself somewhere less breathable. There were over 2,200 souls on board the Titanic, but most of them didn't walk on plush. Most of them didn't own gloves or wear lace. Most of them weren't passengers in the cinematic sense. They were bodies in motion. Staff, stewards, coal trimmers, bakers, cleaners, and immigrants clutching letters in languages that the upper decks didn't know how to pronounce. They lived somewhere between the engine and the ocean, and they didn't smell like lavender. The lower decks of the Titanic, where third class slept, where the crew worked, where linen boiled and soot gathered, were made of narrow hallways and nervous air. The kind of air that had nowhere to go. The ceilings were low, and the walls didn't breathe. Steam rose from basins. Boots tracked in coal dust. and the sheets, always being washed, never quite dried in time. The ship was new, remember. The laundry system gleaming, in theory, was already behind schedule. Imagine waking to the scent of damp cotton and boiled cabbage, your bunkmate's feet dangling 3 inches from your face. No windows, no breeze. Just sweat, salt, and dreams of something better. This was the Titanic for most of its travelers. Third-class passengers were allowed to bring 20 cubic feet of luggage. That's about the size of a generous closet. And inside that closet were everything they owned, everything they'd packed, and everything they'd forgotten they'd miss. A photo, a shawl, a smell. Some rooms had 4 beds. Some had 6. One had 10. The iron bunks were painted white, but the paint chipped when touched. The mattresses were thin, like a question you didn't want to ask. There was no privacy, not really. Just curtains that swayed when someone coughed. Curtains that didn't block much. There was no soundproofing between decks. So even if you tried to sleep, you heard it all. The groan of steel, the hiss of steam, the ceaseless breathing of the boilers, which were never allowed to stop. They devoured 600 tons of coal every day, and every ounce of it had to be shoveled by hand. The men who did that work, they didn't look like ghosts. Not yet. They were real, heavy with muscle and soot, most of them Irish or Welsh, most of them tired before the voyage even began. They earned around £6 a month, less than some first-class passengers tipped their manservants. They labored below sea level, in a heat that could warp your fingernails and split your lip. Each man shoveled coal in shifts, drenched in his own sweat and someone else's breath. There were no fans, no windows, no horizon, and still they whistled. Sometimes, above them, people complained about lukewarm tea. There's a line in a letter written by a third-class woman. Her name was Nora. She described her first night aboard as a little warm, but very fine. Then, in smaller handwriting, I haven't had a proper breath since Queenstown. That was the last line she ever wrote. And it makes you wonder, what does it mean to die on a ship before it sinks? There's a scene they always show in films. A woman in an evening dress walks through the dining saloon glass chandeliers above her, a sea of silver below. The band plays something wistful. Her gloves are ivory, her smile shy, and you can almost hear the violins swell as she glides past 100 kinds of bread rolls. But what they don't show is that it was unbearably hot. The Titanic's first-class dining saloon could seat over 500 guests, and every single one of them wore layers. Corsets, underskirts, suits made of wool. No one was undressed, not even slightly. And yet beneath all that lace and dignity, people were quietly sweating through the performance. There was no air conditioning, of course, just vented pipes and faith. And even those were overworked, thanks to the heating from the kitchens and the flicker of hundreds of gas lamps. That's right, gas. A ship carrying 2,200 souls to the New World, lit in part by fire in metal tubes. You had to act like you didn't notice the warmth, just as you had to act like you enjoyed the foie gras, or the lamb with mint jelly, or the oysters, which, if we're being honest, had been sitting just slightly too long on the cold platter. You could taste the ocean, but not in a good way. The dining saloon was a temple to etiquette, not comfort. There were 13 courses, each with its own wine, its own fork, its own conversational rules. And the chairs were bolted to the floor not for safety, but so no one shifted awkwardly during dessert. You had to know which spoon to use, which shoulder to pass on, which topics were allowed over soup. You could mention the weather, or the stock market, but not the workers, not the Irish, not your cousin's husband, who drank. Certainly not your brother, who worked with his hands. Dinner wasn't nourishment. It was theater, and you weren't prepared for the part. You would have fumbled the fish fork, laughed too loudly at the wrong line, dropped a roll, asked a question to direct. You would have forgotten that caviar was meant to be savored, not chewed. That the waiters didn't introduce themselves, and you weren't meant to thank them not with words. That's the thing no one tells you about first class. It wasn't made to be enjoyed. It was made to be endured correctly. And if you didn't already know how, they'd know. They'd know by your shoes, your accent, the way your eyes lingered too long on the crystal decanter, like it was magic. You might have thought, if only I had money, I could belong here. But money was just a door. Belonging was something you had to inherit, and you didn't. Somewhere, below your feet, a young boy was washing dishes for the 15th hour. He wasn't allowed to look up when first class walked past. He slept in a room that never saw daylight. He knew 100 different types of plates by name. He didn't belong either. Maybe no one did. Maybe that's why it all felt so rehearsed. A ship pretending to be a palace. A voyage pretending to be freedom. A class pretending not to see the iceberg of each other's lives. And maybe that's why, even in the middle of the Atlantic, it felt hard to breathe. They didn't plan for the letters to outlive them, but they did. There's something unbearably tender about the mailroom on the Titanic. It wasn't large. Just a few small rooms deep in the bowels of the ship, somewhere between the all-up deck and the echo of the propellers. But within those narrow walls sat over 3,000 sacks of letters and parcels, stacked, labeled, destined for cities most of the senders had never seen. The Titanic wasn't just a passenger ship. It was an official Royal Mail shipper MS, which meant, in a bureaucratic twist of romance, it carried the words of thousands, love letters, bills, birth announcements, fractured handwriting with lines like, "Tell Ma I'm doing fine, and we arrive soon, God willing." So much paper, so much hope, crammed into canvas bags and trust. 5 postal clerks worked below deck, 3 American, 2 British, all of them young, all of them diligent in that quiet way only unsung civil servants can be. They sorted mail by hand, from sunrise until far past tea. It wasn't glamorous work. The ceiling dripped sometimes. The lights flickered. But there was a reverence to this job of shepherding people's words across oceans. None of them survived. When the water rushed in, it came for them early. One of the clerks was seen dragging sacks of mail up the corridor as the ship tilted, trying desperately to keep the words afloat. Think about that. When faced with the unimaginable, he didn't reach for a life jacket. He reached for the letters. As if maybe, somehow, the story mattered more than the storyteller. And maybe it did, because we don't know what they screamed when the cold hit their lungs. But we do know what was written on some of those pages. We know of a note from a woman named Eleanor to her sister in Chicago. She wrote, "They serve tea every afternoon. I'm pretending to be rich. It's quite fun." She didn't make it, but the note did. Found days later, damp and blurred, but still legible. Still her. There's a kind of immortality in that. Which begs the question, what would your letter have said? Not the one you'd write now, knowing what's coming, but the one you'd scribble at a shared writing desk in 3rd class, or on monogrammed stationery upstairs, lulled by the lull of the sea and the illusion that everything was just beginning. Maybe something mundane, maybe something like, "We saw a whale this morning." Everyone cheered. It felt like a good sign. Maybe that's the saddest part. The quiet belief, printed in ink, that this was just the start of something beautiful. And maybe it was, until it wasn't. It's strange, isn't it? How something can be so large that it disappears. The Titanic was 882 feet long, longer than the tallest building in the world at the time. Taller than the pyramids if you stood it upright. It was, quite literally, too big for most minds to hold. And so, like all overwhelming things, people stopped trying. They marveled, of course, wrote headlines, whispered in dockyards. But once aboard, once you were inside her belly, she stopped being a ship and became a town. A small, floating civilization with neighborhoods and routines and invisible borders. You only saw the pieces, your hallway, your steward, your chair at breakfast. You didn't see the whole, and that made it easier to forget that it could break. There were passengers who never even walked the length of her, who never descended to E-deck or climbed to the bridge. Some never spoke to a soul outside their own class. It was entirely possible to cross an ocean without learning how anyone else lived or died, and yet Titanic was meant to be the great unifier, a marvel of industry, a hymn to human progress. But what it really became was a floating diorama of inequality, so perfectly stratified it might have been designed by a sociologist with a grudge. First class had promenades and personal valets. Second class had books and decency. Third class had hope and boiled potatoes. The crew had orders and silence, and each of them thought the others were far away, but they weren't. They were only a few decks apart, a few staircases, a few paychecks, and they all relied on the same hull. There's something quietly terrifying about that. The illusion of distance, the comfort of compartments. It's the same illusion we carry today between countries, between incomes, between ourselves and the crises we think are far enough away to ignore. Titanic didn't sink because she hit an iceberg. She sank because no one imagined she could. Because confidence, like steel, can be brittle under pressure. Because human error is rarely evil, it's just exhausted, overconfident, underinformed. Because we only see the whole picture once it's already underwater. Before the storm, there were hints, creaks, complaints, odd vibrations when the engines changed. But most ignored them, not because they didn't care, but because they were tired, or dressed for dinner, or trying to fall in love, or asleep. You wouldn't have been any different. You would have looked out at the calm sea, the stars so sharp they seemed like holes in the sky, and thought, everything is fine. And maybe, for a few more hours, it was. But even that calm was borrowed. Even that stillness had a deadline. And the ship, too big to see, kept moving forward, into the part of the story we already know. It's a funny thing, really. The lengths we go to for civility, and the things we forget in the process. On the evening of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic served what would become its final dinner. 13 courses, each one a quiet performance of power. Oysters, consomme, poached salmon, filet mignon, lamb with mint sauce, roast duckling, punch romaine, cold asparagus vinaigrette, pâté de foie gras, peaches in chartreuse jelly. The list goes on like a lullaby for the obscenely comfortable. Outside, the sea was smooth as sleep. The stars blinked politely. Inside, forks were lifted and set down with practiced ease. Wine was poured without asking, and no one spoke of the lifeboats, because it would have been rude to suggest, even lightly, that something might go wrong, that the unsinkable ship could sink, that the dinner might not be digested, that the men in tuxedos and the women in pearl chokers might find themselves someday clinging to the wrong side of steel. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats, enough for about half the people on board. But no one complained. No one questioned. That wasn't done. Why spoil a good meal with something as vulgar as safety? Somewhere in the second-class dining room, a young couple from Devon was talking about jobs in America. She wanted to teach piano. He was hoping to fix typewriters. They had no idea they wouldn't be allowed on the top deck if things went badly. Somewhere below, in third class, a group of Finnish girls laughed over bread and jam, talking about Chicago. They didn't know the gates might be locked when the time came. And somewhere in first class, someone likely remarked, "The beef is a little dry," and thought it was the most pressing matter of the evening. There's something cruelly elegant about it. The precision with which class divided not only space, but knowledge, access, time. Some people knew what the flares meant. Others didn't even know flares existed. And the irony, they had plenty of corkscrews. Too many, maybe, but not enough cork. That's how the lifeboats were built, you see. Cork-lined, wooden, barely tested. Designed to reassure, not to work. Most passengers didn't know how many there were, didn't ask, because asking meant you thought about needing one, and thinking about need was indecorous. So instead, they dressed, they dined, they passed the PT, they complimented the veal, and they didn't say a word, because manners are funny like that. They keep you from screaming in the places you should. They let you swallow doubt with your soup. They make you feel polite when you should be afraid. That night, the dinner was a masterpiece of distraction, a final act of culinary denial, and no one noticed that time, too, was on its last course. It's one of the most famous stories from that night, told so often it feels half myth, that as the ship tilted and the stars loomed overhead like spectators, the band played on. And they did. But what's less often told is how long they had been playing before anything went wrong. From mid-afternoon tea until nearly midnight, the Titanic's musicians were working. Not lounging, not improvising jazz beneath the moonlight. Working. 6 men with instruments they didn't own. Dressed in uniforms they had to pay for. Playing songs requested by people who didn't know their names. The White Star Line didn't employ the musicians directly. They were hired through an agency, and they weren't considered crew, so technically, they didn't have lifeboat assignments. Technically, they were cargo, ornamental, soundtrack. They were paid less than a stoker. And still, they played. In the lounges, in the reception rooms, beside the footfalls of bored millionaires and distracted debutantes. They played waltzes and rags, and the kind of gentle piano melodies that make you forget you're tired. They played as women gossiped, and men smoked, and stewards glided silently past with silver trays. They played while people wrote letters they wouldn't finish, and then they kept playing. When the iceberg hit, there was a moment brief and quiet when it felt like nothing had happened. A soft jolt, a shiver, a noise, but distant. Conversations paused. Someone said, "Well, that was odd." Another made a joke, and then the music returned, not because it was required, not because someone ordered them to, but because silence was worse. Wallace Hartley, the bandleader, was the son of a choirmaster. He believed in the power of melody to soothe, to contain, to lift. When the corridors started to hum with worry, he brought his violin to the first-class lounge and began to play. The others joined him. They played light, they played soft, they played like men trying to stitch calm back into the air. No one told them to stay, they just did. Hours later, someone would remember them standing in a line on the deck, waist-deep and cold, their bow ties soaked, fingers stiff, still holding on to the last notes of a world that was ending politely. We don't know what the last song was. Some say nearer, my God, to thee. Others insist it was autumn. It doesn't matter. What matters is that someone chose to give beauty to a night that didn't deserve it. What matters is that even as lifeboats groaned and officers shouted and the black Atlantic waited with open arms, 6 men with trembling hands tried to keep the moment kind. Not heroic, not brave, just kind, in the most fragile, fleeting way. They knew they would not be saved. Not really, but they stayed. They played. They made the ship sound alive, one final time. And when the silence came again, it was unbearable. It's a strange thing, what people choose to carry. When the evacuation begins, lowly, confusedly, with the stubborn civility of a world that didn't yet understand, it wasn't like the movies. No rushing, no screaming, just decisions. Some passengers, told to dress warmly, layered fur over silk, pearls over nightgowns. Some went back for gloves, for combs, for a favorite book. A man in first class was seen holding a silver thermos and a walking stick. A woman wrapped her Pomeranian in a shawl, and someone else stuffed her coat pockets with ice. Not out of panic, out of practicality. She thought it would help keep her food cold once they were rescued. She assumed they'd be picked up quickly, that the night was just a strange detour, that she'd be having breakfast in New York by Tuesday. The human mind is a marvel of denial. Lifeboats were lowered half full, not because of cruelty, not because of conspiracy, but because people hesitated. They looked at the dark, bobbing crafts hanging off the side of the Titan cold. Exposed, fragile land, they looked at the ship itself, still lit, still warm, still humming with life. And they chose the comfort they knew, wouldn't you? People don't like leaving what still works, even if it's sinking, especially then. There were rumors that the ship was fine, that they were only launching boats as a drill, that someone had exaggerated. A steward reportedly told a woman to get in the lifeboat and return after a short row around the ship. Just to be safe, he said, like she was going out for a stroll. So she took her gloves, and her handbag, and her fruit knife, and filled her pockets with ice cubes, just in case. Because surely someone would be along to collect them, to serve them tea, to apologize for the inconvenience. Even as the ship tilted, the rituals persisted. Men lit cigarettes. Children were hushed with candy. There was, for a time, a sense of decorum so stubborn it bordered on spiritual. An entire civilization refusing to believe it could unravel. And yet, beneath that layer of politeness, fear crept in. It crept in through the steel, through the strain in the hull, through the eyes of officers who began to understand the math, through the night air, which was colder than anyone had expected, and through the knowledge, spoken or not, that there were not enough lifeboats, not for everyone, not even close. So the decisions got stranger, more tender, more desperate. A man gave his wife a piece of his watch chain, then stepped back into the crowd. A mother tied her child's name into her collar. A maid wrapped a letter around her wrist with a ribbon, and someone tucked ice into her pockets like hope. It's absurd, it's heartbreaking, it's completely human. Because what do you carry when you don't believe the end is coming? Whatever you can. The Titanic had many doors. Some led to luxury, some led to work, some led to nowhere at all. But there was one that became infamous because it didn't open when it should have. Down on the lower decks, between third class and the upper world, were gates, physical, literal barriers, not because anyone expected danger, but because the law said different classes had to be kept apart. Health codes, quarantine protocols, the logic of distance. So they built separation into the ship itself. And when the water began to rise, those gates became questions. Did someone forget to unlock them? Did someone lose the key? Or did someone just once, in that hour of cold and chaos, look at a group of desperate faces and hesitate? We don't know. The official reports say the gates were opened in time, that no one was deliberately held back, that the crew did their best, and perhaps they did, but the numbers tell a quieter story. In first class, 60% survived. In third class, less than a quarter, and among children, the contrast is sharper still. Nearly all of the first-class children lived. More than half of the third-class children did not. Why? Because knowledge is its own lifeboat. Because when the ship groaned and the corridors began to list, the first-class passengers were told where to go. Their paths were lit, their exits marked. Their steward knew their names. In third class, the lights flickered. The directions were in English. Some couldn't read them. The corridors turned into traps. Water ran faster than sound. There were no maps, no instructions, just rising cold and the frantic knock of someone else's hope on the other side of a door. And there were gates, not to keep people in, just to sort them. That was the idea. A small idea, a bureaucratic formality, and it became something monstrous. Because when disaster comes, it doesn't care about class. But class will still shape how you get to the deck, and how fast, and whether the boat is already gone. Imagine it. You're 16. You've never seen the ocean before this week. You're in a nightgown, holding your brother's hand, running down a narrow corridor you don't recognize. You hit a gate, it's locked, or stuck, or maybe you just don't know how it works. You call out, no one comes, because they're not looking here, not yet, and you wait. That's the part no one tells you. That before the screaming, before the darkness, before the chaos that everyone remembers, there was waiting. Just ... waiting behind a gate, behind a decision, behind a line that was never meant to mean life or death, but did. There's something chilling not in the oceanic sense, but in the moral one about watching a lifeboat drift away with empty seats. And it happened, over and over. Boat after boat lowered into the still Atlantic with space to spare. Sometimes 6 seats, sometimes 20. One boat, meant to hold 65, left with just 28. Why? Because no one quite believed they needed saving. Because some refused to leave without their husbands, and the crew wouldn't let men aboard. Because others hesitated, waiting for instructions, for permission, for someone in a uniform to say yes, now it's real. Because the lifeboats looked flimsy, cold, unsafe. Because Titanic, lit from stem to stern, still looked like the better bet. And also, because chaos is rarely loud at first. It begins as suggestion, as murmur, as perhaps we should. People mill about. They adjust their scarves. They listen. They wait. They don't want to be the first to panic. That would be embarrassing. That would be impolite. So the boat lowered slowly, quietly, politely, half full. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't malice. It was something softer and more dangerous. Trust in the wrong thing. Trust in size. In reputation. In steel and rivets and the arrogance of technology. Trust in the system. That someone had accounted for this. That there were enough boats somewhere. That someone else would fix it. That someone else would pay attention. But no one had. And by the time they realized, it was too late to fill the seats. Officers stopped shouting. They started begging. Women and children, please hurry. But the hesitation had already set the clock. By the time belief caught up with reality, the boats were in the water, bobbing like unanswered questions. Some passengers didn't want to sit beside strangers. Some worried about the cold more than the sinking. Some believed there was still time, and some were simply never told. There's a line from a survivor's letter written days later on borrowed paper from a borrowed room in New York. She wrote, "We left with 23. I kept looking back. The ship was still lit. I thought it was a mistake. It wasn't, and that light so lovely, so falsely comforting, was not hope. It was electricity. And electricity, like civility, does not float. They say the sea was like glass that night. No wind, no waves, just stars above, and a silence that no one knew how to fill, except with lifeboats that left the noise behind. Quiet little vessels, carrying disbelief, one oar stroke at a time, not full, not ready, but gone. If you had stood on deck, that night just stood there, alone. Beneath the sky, you might have believed you were standing in the middle of a painting. The sea was glass. Not poetic glass, but the kind that unsettles. No waves, no spray, no sound. Just a flat black sheet stretching forever, stitched at the edges with stars. Sailors called it eerie, officers called it dangerous, but passengers, well, they called it beautiful. And beauty, as ever, makes us reckless. The stillness was so complete, so unnaturally calm, that it deceived even the seasoned ones. Icebergs were spotted hours earlier, huge white specters drifting low in the horizon, but without waves. Without moonlight, they lost their outlines, became shadows, ghosts of ice. Silence incarnate, no splashing, no warning. Just a darkness, darker than the rest. In the crow's nest, lookouts peered through the void, eyes watering from cold, bellies tight with cold stew and worse sleep. They had no binoculars. Someone had misplaced the key to the locker that held them. And by the time the shape loomed ahead, it was too late. You might have thought the Titanic struck the iceberg like a car hits a wall, but it didn't. The sound was soft, a shudder, a scrape, like a finger sliding slowly across a violin string. People said it felt more like slowing down than crashing. A hesitation, a stutter step in steel. Not enough to wake you if you were sleeping, just enough to make you pause mid-sentence. A man brushing his teeth in first class paused. A woman tucking in her child paused. A stoker below didn't pause at all. He ran, because he knew the sound of death better than anyone above. But on deck, under the stars, you might not have noticed anything. The ship kept moving, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting detail. That the Titanic did not stop. Not at once, not completely. It drifted forward, full of light, full of breath, full of people deciding whether or not to put on a coat. The engines slowed, the crew whispered, officers made calculations, but to most of you it still looked like a miracle on water. People took pictures of it earlier that day, from other ships, described it like a palace with smokestacks, and hours later, it still looked exactly the same, except it had already been wounded, and no one knew how deep the wound would go. That's the cruel thing about stillness. It looks so much like safety. The Atlantic didn't rush in with drama. It crept through the lower decks first, where no one important was looking, past the crates and the ropes, past the forgotten luggage, the letters, the stowed potatoes, past the crew members, on their fourth cup of weak tea, who suddenly found their boots soaked without explanation. The cold didn't scream, it seeped. Steel does something strange in freezing water. It groans, yes, but it also tightens, contracts, The walls themselves began to pulse with a pressure they weren't built to bear. And deep below, where the mailbags floated briefly like ghosts of ink, the ocean took its first breath inside the ship. Not everyone believed it at first. A man in second class went back to his room after the jolt and wrote in his diary, "Slight disturbance, nothing serious." He did not finish the entry. Another woman, in third class, complained of wet floors and asked if her bed could be moved. By the time she asked, the corridor behind her was already gone. Above, people were still dancing, still talking, still measuring the night by clinks of glass and half-finished jokes. But down below, the water had begun to teach its quiet language, and it moved with the confidence of something invited. Cold, you see, is a slow kind of thief. It doesn't knock, it doesn't ask. It simply waits until the fire is out and then takes whatever you didn't guard. The passengers who first met the water didn't understand it, not at first. They stepped into it like it was a mistake, shouted for someone to fix it. But the sea is not a man in a uniform. It doesn't answer, and still, no sirens, no alarms, only footsteps, running, then more. On the top decks, the stars stayed still. The band played on. The breath of the ship began to catch. The crew whispered too much. And finally, someone asked, "Should we be worried?" But the cold wasn't waiting for permission. It had already taken the boilers, the baggage room, the post office, the dreams pinned in envelopes, the coins in unattended trunks. It had already claimed the boots of a boy who had only ever wanted to see New York. And now it was moving up, one deck at a time, with no intention of stopping. There's a peculiar elegance to human denial. When the truth grows teeth, we reach for tradition, for routines, for the rituals of a world we still believe in. And on the Titanic, as the night deepened and the cold climbed the stairwells, the wealthy dressed themselves as if the evening were just continuing. They put on tuxedos. They reapplied lipstick. They tied cravats with hands that trembled only slightly. A woman changed into her best velvet gown, in case, she said, we're seen getting into boats, as if rescue required presentation, as if death might be more gracious to the well-attired. There was a gentleman in top hat and tails who refused a life jacket because, in his words, one must maintain appearances. Another man tucked a bottle of port under his arm, muttering something about last toasts. A steward noted half admiring, half aghast that no one screamed in first class until the lights dimmed. Before that, they waited in orderly lines, complained politely, asked if breakfast would still be served in the morning. Some thought the lifeboats would circle back in half an hour. Some believed this was part of the journey, a drill, a delay. No one wants to believe that the party has become a funeral. And yet, it had, because as the tilt grew more pronounced, so too did the rituals. Husbands walked their wives to the lifeboats, then stepped back, not with panic, with ceremony, a kiss, a nod, a line like, "I'll see you in the morning." They didn't mean it as lies. They meant it as hope. Hope wrapped in etiquette. Hope dressed in satin and starch. Because if the end was coming, it would not be uncivilized. It would not be loud. It would not take them barefoot or in disarray. They would meet it like gentlemen, like ladies, like people who had grown up learning that dignity was the one thing you could keep when everything else had been repossessed. And what is dignity, really, if not a costume we wear when we're afraid? The ship tilted, the music played, the lifeboats lowered, and still the rich clung to their cufflinks and polished shoes, as if the ice would notice, as if death would check for dinner reservations. They didn't know, of course, that the sea doesn't care for decorum, that the tuxedo would weigh the same as the body, that velvet sinks, that politeness does not float. But they dressed anyway, and in doing so, they reminded us of something, that even when we cannot control our fate, we try desperately to control the way we're seen by it. Not everyone ran, not everyone scrambled, some simply stayed. Not because they didn't know, not because they didn't care, but because they had made peace with the moment in a way that almost looked like grace. There was a Baker Charles, Joan, who didn't panic. He made sure the kitchen staff got out. Then he threw chairs overboard to use as flotation. Then he drank half a bottle of brandy and waited. He would survive the night somehow. Floating in the black Atlantic, limbs stiff, heart burning. But this isn't his story, not yet. This part is about the ones who stayed below, the engineers, the firemen, the trimmers. They knew they weren't getting off. They didn't bother with lifeboats. They didn't ask. They didn't knock on first-class doors. They stayed where the ship breathed hardest, where the boilers screamed and the pressure howled and the water began to snap at the metal like teeth. They stayed to keep the lights on. Think about that. They could have run. Could have said, to hell with it, let the dark come. But they didn't. Because if the lights went out too early, panic would come faster. Mothers wouldn't find their children. Crew wouldn't find the boats. The officers couldn't see the ropes. The violinists couldn't see their strings. So these men, names mostly forgotten, held the ship's lungs together for just a little longer. They stood waist-deep in freezing water, coaxing breath from a machine that was already dying, just to buy others a few more moments of illusion. Not heroism, not glory, just time. A steward named Albert Piercy gave up his life jacket and led women to the deck in the dark. A storekeeper named Frank Prentice tried to carry an elderly woman when the stairs became rivers. A radio operator, Jack Phillips, kept tapping out distress signals long after he was told to leave. Nobody made a speech. Nobody asked to be remembered. They just kept doing their jobs until the ship made it impossible. And then, slowly, the lights began to flicker. Not all at once, not dramatically, just here and there. A chandelier dimming, a hallway darkening, the piano light winking out, until the ship looked less like a palace and more like a shadow. And then the generators failed. And then it was night, not just above, but within. A night so complete it felt like forgetting. But in that darkness, we remember them. The ones who stayed, because someone had to. By the time the bow dipped for good, the lifeboats had stopped launching. The ropes were tangled. The deck was too steep. The last few boats had gone, some with 20, some with 60, all drifting into the blackness with oars that weren't long enough and instructions that weren't clear. And those left behind remained more than 1,000 people. Some stood in groups, holding hands without speaking. Some prayed not loudly, but inwardly, the kind of prayer that doesn't ask for survival, only for meaning. Others sat down, right there on the tilting deck, dressed in suits, in dresses, in their good shoes. They didn't scream, not yet. They just watched. And the ship, now a thing of myth and muscle, began to rise at one end. Not quickly, not like the movies, slowly, awfully, with the dignity of a cathedral collapsing in slow motion. The stars kept watching. The sea was so still it might have been holding its breath, and the ship cracked, not like thunder, not like fury, but like a giant sigh, bone-tired and inevitable. The sound was heard by those in the lifeboats, a groaning, wrenching, cosmic unfastening, steel pulling away from itself, the deepest kind of grief. The ship, once too big to see, was now too broken to save. And still, the lights flickered one last time, and then darkness. Utter, terrible, final. Some people jumped. Some waited. Some fell. The sea did not lurch to meet them. It took its time. It was not a monster. It was not merciful. It was just there, cold beyond imagining, quiet beyond belief. And it opened its mouth without malice. The water swallowed the stern, swallowed the funnels, swallowed the china, the chandeliers, the letters, swallowed names, swallowed futures, swallowed the myth that man could build something too mighty to fall. And then there was nothing. No ship, no sound, no song. Only lifeboats adrift, rocking in horror. Only stars reflected in a sea that didn't look any different than it had an hour before. Only silence, interrupted by the slow, steady sound of people calling out, "Help, please, over here." And then, eventually, not even that. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't belong to this world. You only find it in very few places. After a bomb, after a storm, after grief arrives, wearing the clothes of disbelief. It's not silence. It's what happens after the sound has finished dying. That was the quiet over the Atlantic after the Titanic was gone. The ship had disappeared, slipped beneath the surface like it had been erased, not sunk. The sea closed around it with a terrible calm. No froth, no whirlpool, no wreckage bobbing to the top like in the stories. Just a faint disturbance, like someone had turned over in their sleep beneath a blanket of black. But the ocean wasn't empty. Not yet. Over 1,500 people were in the water. And here's where it becomes hard to imagine, because we think we know cold, but we don't. The North Atlantic that night was just above freezing, barely a breath above death. You don't freeze instantly. You don't die politely. You seize. Your muscles contract. Your chest locks. Your lungs forget how to breathe because the body has decided it's better to forget everything at once. People screamed, and then they didn't. The cries echoed across the water, bouncing between the lifeboats like unanswered questions. Some begged, some prayed, some called for loved ones by name, and some just cried. But that couldn't last, because the human throat isn't made for screaming in seawater. One by one, the voices faded. It took 20 minutes. 20. That's how long most of them lasted. Not all, a few, miraculously, held on longer, on overturned rafts, on floating debris, on sheer stubbornness. But the vast majority, 20 minutes. Long enough for the lifeboats to hear. Not long enough for them to return. Because most boats didn't go back. Not right away. They were afraid. And maybe you would have been too. Imagine it. You've just escaped the unthinkable. You're sitting in a lifeboat, half soaked, your hands numb, your mind reeling. You hear hundreds of voices, real voices, human voices, begging you to help. But your boat is already low in the water. You've got children beside you. The night is so dark it feels like it's pressing on your skin. Do you turn back? Do you risk it? Or do you sit in the dark and wait for the screaming to stop? They did. Most of them did. And when the silence finally came, it wasn't relief. It was a wound. Because now it was quiet enough to hear the truth. They were alone, and the ship was not coming back. They didn't talk, not much. The lifeboats floated in the dark, each one carrying a few dozen survivors, each one suddenly aware of how small they were. No engine, no compass, just oars and breath and the weight of what they'd just watched. There was nothing to do but drift and wait, for morning, for rescue, for the illusion of meaning to return. Some clung to each other. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions unreadable in the starlight. The only sounds were the lap of water, the creak of wood, and the occasional sob that escaped like steam from a wound. One woman rocked back and forth, repeating the same name. One man tried to light a cigarette, but his hands shook too badly to strike the match. Some began to argue quietly but bitterly about why they hadn't gone back. Boat 6 could have taken more, so could Boat 14, but they hadn't. They'd sat, paralyzed by cold and fear, by too many variables, by the nightmare math of how many lives one lifeboat could carry before it became another tragedy, and guilt is a terrible companion in small spaces, even worse in silence. There was one boat now, one, the so-called millionaire's boat, that left the ship nearly empty, just 12 people aboard, mostly men. It became a symbol, later, of cowardice and privilege, of all that had gone wrong in the cold calculus of class. But at the time, floating in the dark, it was just another piece of wood with breath on it. They all looked the same in the end. Cold, silent, scared, but none more so than the one they called the collapsible boat be an overturned lifeboat. Not launched properly, just found adrift by survivors. Nearly 30 people clambered onto it, sitting, standing, gripping anything they could to stay above the water. There was no room, no safety. Just legs going numb and eyes scanning the horizon for a dawn that wouldn't come fast enough. Lawrence Beasley, a second-class passenger, described the night as a nightmare that refused to forget itself. He sat in a boat full of strangers, unable to stop hearing the cries that had come before. The ocean, he wrote, seemed indifferent, the stars almost mocking. The worst part, he said, was not the fear, it was the shame. Because survival doesn't feel heroic when others are missing. It feels borrowed. It feels conditional. And the lifeboats knew that. Each one an island of unwanted memory. Each one a floating confession. Each one drifting further into a new world, wondering what they were meant to say when the rescue finally came. If it came, because by then, the Titanic wasn't just a ship that had sunk. It was a question, and they were the only ones left to answer it. Just before dawn, they saw it. A shape on the horizon, low, blinking, real. The RMS Carpathia. It wasn't a grand ship. It wasn't meant for rescue. But it was there, and that was enough. For hours, the lifeboats had drifted like scattered thoughts. Now, for the first time, they began to converge. Toward the light, toward the living, toward the chance that this night would not be their last word. But they didn't cheer. Not really. The survivors' row door drifted silently, numb, exhausted, the kind of tired that doesn't lift when you sleep, because it lives somewhere under the ribs. Some wept, some just stared, some asked, over and over, is it real? It was. Carpathia's crew had been steaming toward the coordinates for hours, pushing their engines beyond safe limits. They didn't know what they'd find. They didn't know if it would be wreckage or rescue. They found both. Lifeboat after lifeboat pulled alongside. Women were lifted first, then children, then the men. Each one a story that would never be told fully. Each one stepping aboard with eyes too wide for daylight. They offered them blankets, coffee, brandy, questions. Most couldn't answer. Not right away. One steward tried to count them tally names against the manifest, but the numbers refused to add up. Too many missing. Too many unknowns. Too many faces that had never been recorded in the first place. There were rumors that another ship had helped, that people had survived on rafts, that maybe the Titanic was still out there, limping to port. Denial doesn't end when the screaming does. It lingers. Echoes, they began to list the saved. Telegraph operators tapped out names like prayers. And still, it wasn't enough. Not nearly. More than 1,500 people had gone into the water. Only around 700 came out. The rest, never seen again. Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, walked the decks, overseeing the recovery. He was hailed as a hero. He did not want to be. "I just got there," he said. "It wasn't fast enough." Some survivors looked back, searching the horizon for wreckage, for friends, for closure, but there was none. The sea had already decided what to return and what to keep. They left wreaths of flowers where the ship had vanished, bouquets of mourning thrown into water too deep to care. And then Carpathia turned toward New York. There was nothing else to do. The sun had risen. The spell had broken. The tragedy was now a timeline. But no one on board felt rescued. Not yet. Not really. Because survival, when it's that uneven, feels more like haunting than grace. And the Carpathia sailed forward, heavy with ghosts. When Carpathia pulled into New York on the night of April 18th, the rain was waiting. It had been falling all day, gentle but insistent, as if the sky had been tipped slightly and left ajar. The kind of rain that fills cracks in pavement and washes over stone without asking. It felt fitting. Even the city, loud, fast, breathless New York, seemed unsure of how to greet what was coming. Crowds gathered at the docks, thousands of them, not just families, not just reporters, but strangers too. People who needed to see that something had arrived from the night, that the sea hadn't taken everything. They expected chaos, tragedy, certainly, but not this silence, because that's what came first. When the gangplank lowered and the first survivors stepped onto land, there were no cheers, no cries, just umbrellas and the clicking of shoes and the steady, awful sound of someone trying not to cry too loudly in public. Women wrapped in blankets, men with vacant stares, children who wouldn't let go of strangers' hands. Carpathia had done its best. The crew handed out clothing, food, hot drinks. Survivors shared staterooms, huddled on the floor, whispered names in the dark. But grief isn't something that waits for port. It seeps in along the way, and when they arrived, they brought it with them. There were mistakes, families reunited with the wrong person, names misspelled in newspaper lists. One woman found her husband's name printed among the dead. He was standing next to her, drenched and too tired to speak. Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashed. Questions were shouted like accusations. How did it happen? What did you see? Why didn't more survive? No one had the answers. One young steward simply said, "We ran out of boats." That was all. Some survivors found relatives waiting. Others found no one. A few were taken to hospitals, many to hotels. Some wandered into the city without a plan. One woman walked 4 miles in the rain, still wearing her life jacket. The city didn't quite know what to do with them. A tragedy that vast doesn't slot easily into the rhythm of a modern world. It doesn't end when it docks. It doesn't heal when the rain stops. It lingers in the clothes that never dried, in the letters never delivered, in the name of a ship that went from miracle to myth in less than 3 hours. No one really slept that night. Not the survivors, not the families, not the city. Because when grief comes dressed in velvet and salt water, it doesn't knock. It just arrives, and expects you to answer. In the days that followed, the world tried to make sense of it all. They printed names, pages and pages of names. Saved, missing, dead. The newspapers couldn't keep up. Corrections followed corrections. Some names appeared in both columns, some never appeared at all. Immigrants, crew, children who hadn't yet learned to spell their own names. They disappeared not just into the ocean, but into the footnotes of tragedy. And then came the inquiries, the hearings, the interviews, the sharp pens of senators and judges. Men in suits asked survivors to describe what it felt like to drown, what it felt like to watch others drown, what lifeboat they were in, who gave the orders, who ignored the ice warnings, who saw the flare, who gave up a seat. Testimonies spilled out like ballast. Yes, the music played. No, we didn't turn back. I don't know how I survived. There was a steward who confessed he couldn't stop hearing the sound of boots slipping on steel. A nurse who said she dreamed of ice every night. A boy who had lost his mother, but held tight to her locket the entire time. He said nothing for weeks. Then, one morning, he looked up and whispered. She let go. The White Star Line offered explanations. They offered condolences. They offered that first no money. Lawsuits bloomed like weeds. And beneath it all, the world began to understand what had happened. The Titanic had been more than a ship. It was a mirror of inequality, of arrogance, of misplaced trust. It was the idea that progress could replace caution, that appearance could substitute for preparation, that if you gave something a name like unsinkable, it would believe you. They built monuments, held memorials, staged performances in mourning clothes, and then, slowly, they moved on, because that's what people do, even when they're not ready, even when part of them is still sitting in a lifeboat, watching the lights go out, even when their coat still smells like salt and smoke. But the names remained, etched in granite, carved into bronze, written in quiet family stories passed down like heirlooms. Some recited every April, some whispered only in private, when the house is still and the night returns, and they're not always names of the dead. Sometimes they're names of the lucky, the spared, the ones who lived and never knew what to do with that, the ones who survived and never said why, because survival, when no one else did, becomes its own burden, and history, when it can't explain, becomes poetry, heavy, flawed, and haunting, but still trying, still writing, still remembering. Even now, the survivors didn't speak of it, not right away. Some never did. Not because they didn't remember, but because remembering was too loud, too jagged, too unfinished. What they had lived through didn't feel like a story, felt like a splinter, something you learned to work around, something you stopped touching. Survival has a strange weight. It doesn't make you feel lucky, not always. Sometimes it makes you feel miscast, as if you stumbled into someone else's ending and forgot your line. They came home to beds that didn't rock, to clocks that ticked forward, to a world that wanted answers and tidy narratives. But they weren't tidy anymore. Some passengers tried to go back to normal. Afternoon teas, dinner parties, letters from relatives that began, "So glad to hear you made it," as if it were that simple. Others couldn't stay in one place. They moved cities, changed names, married someone they barely knew, or didn't marry at all, or drank too much, or talked too loudly in bars until someone asked them to stop. Because when you've watched a ship vanish and heard people vanish with it, silence isn't peaceful, it's punishment. Ruth Becker was just 12 when she survived. Her lifeboat was among the last to be found. She grew up, became a teacher, had children. For decades, she never spoke about that night. Not because she didn't remember, but because the words had teeth. Only near the end of her life did she begin to speak. She said, "We didn't know it would be remembered." as if memory was something that needed permission, as if history needed a signature. Others found themselves living in two worlds. The one before, where they boarded a ship called Titanic, and the one after, where everything felt fragile and absurd. A waiter from second class became a janitor. He said it felt better to mop the floor than to serve people pretending not to be afraid of anything. A young bride who lost her husband never remarried. She kept the shoes she wore in the lifeboat under her bed, not as a reminder, as proof. Proof that she had been somewhere she wasn't supposed to return from, and that she did. We like to think survival is triumphant, but often it's quiet. Often it's lonely. Often it's a life carried like an overcoat 2 sizes too large. The kind that slips off when no one's looking. The kind that still smells like the sea. They were given a nickname, the lifeboat people. It sounds quaint, now like something out of folklore. A community made not by geography or blood, but by water, by fate, by proximity to disaster. They had nothing in common except that they lived, and that was enough. For a while they held gatherings, quiet, formal affairs. Survivors of Titanic reunited in hotel ballrooms or church basements. They would wear black, share coffee, read the names of the lost, and then they'd go home to their separate lives, their separate ghosts, because what else could they do? There was no blueprint for this kind of grief, no handbook for being the one who didn't drown. So they made one in the only way they knew how. They checked in, they sent letters. They raised money for memorials and for each other. They tried to become the kind of family that the sea hadn't taken from them, but it didn't last. Time, cruelly efficient, does what it always does. It moves on, and the world, busy with new wars and new ships and new tragedies, began to forget. The Titanic became a story, then a legend, then a film reel flickering in smoky theaters, and the lifeboat people. They aged, they scattered, they went quiet again, because eventually even memory gets tired. Even grief needs rest. There's a photo taken years later of 6 survivors sitting on a park bench in London. No fanfare, no speeches, just them, wrinkled, weathered, still holding something between them that no one else could quite understand. Not shared trauma, exactly. More like a shared silence, the kind that doesn't need explaining. And that's what history forgets, sometimes. That trauma isn't just an event, it's a language, and only the fluent can speak it without flinching. The lifeboat people didn't always talk about the ship, but they knew how to listen when someone else did. There's comfort in that, in knowing there are others who understand why you wake up suddenly at 3 a.m, or why your closet still smells faintly of salt, or why you never board a boat without looking for the lifeboats first, counting them quietly under your breath. It's not superstition, it's remembrance. The lifeboat people didn't choose each other, but the sea did. And long after the world had filed Titanic away under history and hubris, they remembered it not as a story, but as a night. One very long, very cold night that never entirely ended. Some survivors changed their stories, not because they were dishonest, but because the truth had become unbearable, or unspeakable, or simply too unfinished. There was a man who claimed he'd been pulled into a lifeboat after helping load women and children. In truth, he'd jumped. Not early, not greedily, just when it was time. But the shame of surviving before others did clung to him like seaweed. So he changed it, just a little, just enough. Another woman said she never saw her fiancé in the water, said he disappeared in the confusion, but someone else remembered seeing her hold his body, even as she drifted towards safety. And there was the steward who insisted he stayed at his post until the very end. But the records showed he boarded lifeboat 9 before the second funnel collapsed. Does it matter? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Because survival doesn't make anyone a saint. It makes you human, messy, flawed, a creature of instinct and panic and breath. And breath, on that night, was in short supply. The ocean doesn't judge the timing of your leap. It doesn't rank your courage by chronology, but the world does. And so did the newspapers, and so did the courts, and so did the people reading headlines in cafes, asking, why him? Why her? Why not? It's always the nots that echo. So the survivors made new versions, softer versions, versions where they had helped more, hesitated less, versions that earned them forgiveness they weren't even sure they needed. And sometimes they believed those versions, because memory isn't fixed. It's a house we keep renovating, even when no one visits. But every so often, usually in sleep, or silence, or on long walks by water, the cracks would show. A name would return. A voice, a hand reaching for theirs in the dark that never made it. And they would remember. Not the lie, not the press version, but the truth that they lived. That others didn't, and that no story could make peace with that. So they did what humans do best. They continued, they married, or didn't, worked, or wandered, told stories, or wrote them down and locked them in drawers. Some died with secrets. Others left behind memoirs, letters, diary entries that spoke in fragments and ellipses. But always, beneath the words, was the same quiet confession: I stayed afloat. That's all, and sometimes that's too much. You might think the worst part of surviving the Titanic was the night itself. But for many, the hardest part came later. In the dark, when no one was watching. When the body was safe but the mind refused to believe it. There were dreams, terrible ones. Of cold, of steel, of voices calling through fog. Dreams that began in warmth and ended in water. Dreams that returned again and again, uninvited, like tides. A fireman named Frederick Barrett, who had been in the boiler room when the iceberg hit, later admitted he couldn't sleep without hearing the hiss of the ruptured pipe. He lived, he remarried, he worked. But at night, he clenched his fists until they bled. He wasn't alone. Violet Jessup, a stewardess and nurse who survived not only the Titanic but also its sister ships Britannic and Olympic when they were damaged, kept a rosary beneath her pillow. She smiled often, was called brave, but she rarely stayed long in one place, as if still listening for alarms. And then there were those who never seemed to move on at all. A man named Michel Navratil, just a child during the sinking, grew up with the image of his father handing him into a lifeboat. Alone, his father didn't survive. Michel did. He grew into a quiet man who never liked large crowds or the sound of orchestras. Too many violins, he once said. Too much memory. These aren't the stories we're told often, because they're harder to watch, harder to wrap in strings and scripts. They don't end at the rescue. They begin there. They begin with the question, what does it mean to come back from the edge? And the answer almost always is, it means you carry the edge with you, in your hands, in your chest, in your sleep. Some survivors grew afraid of the sea. Others couldn't stay away from it. Some avoided the anniversary. Others lit candles every year without fail. All of them knew something most people never have to. That the line between before and after is thinner than we think. Sometimes it's a flicker. Sometimes it's an iceberg. And sometimes it's just a chair in the night, empty where someone should be sitting. The dreams don't leave. Not really, they just soften, fade at the corners. But if you ever meet someone who's truly survived something, anything, you'll see it. In the eyes, the way they look at doors, or water, or crowds, the way they pause before speaking, the way they go quiet when the world gets too loud. That's the cost, and it's paid in sleep. Long after the last survivor died, after the final lifeboat reunion, after the final interview, after the final newspaper obituary, there were still things. Things pulled from the sea. Things kept in drawers. Things sold at auction with price tags that felt like apologies. A pocket watch stopped at 2:20. The exact moment the Titanic disappeared. A pair of boots, worn smooth at the soles, recovered from a boy who had no name. A violin, warped and water-stained, believed to be Wallace Hartley's, the one he played as the ship slipped beneath the stars. A menu from the final dinner, smudged with wine and fingerprints, the courses still listed in elegant, indifferent French. A life jacket cracked, splintering at the straps, still heavy with salt. These were more than relics. They were grief in solid form. Because sometimes objects remember what people can't. When the stories become too big, too tangled, too unbearable, the things remain. They don't forget. They don't reframe. They don't reframe. They just hold. The weight, the silence, the truth. Museums call them artifacts. Collectors call them pieces of history. But really, they are remains, not of bodies, but of a world that ended mid-sentence. There's something haunting about a shoe on display behind glass. You begin to wonder, did the person who wore this scream, or did they whisper? Did they know what was happening, or were they still asleep, dreaming of coffee and arrival and letters they meant to write? These objects don't tell you, they don't weep, they don't explain, they just exist, quietly, softly, like the last breath of a story you almost forgot to finish. And in that silence is everything. Because when the survivors were gone, when the lifeboats had docked and the memories had dulled and the documentaries had stopped being made, these things stayed. They sat in museum cases, in private collections, in attics, and every so often someone would find one. A button, a ticket, a torn page of a diary, and they'd stop, hold it, wonder. And in that moment, the Titanic was no longer a ship. It was a hand reaching through time. It was a name, a scent, a question. It was a whisper saying, I was here, and you hear it, even now. The iceberg didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't sneak in under moonlight, wearing fog like a cloak. It didn't arrive too late to be seen. It wasn't a twist ending. The Titanic was warned. Not once, multiple times. In the hours before the collision, at least 6 messages were received from other ships, radioed in Morse code, telling of ice ahead, pack ice, drifting bergs, a scattering of frozen teeth right in the ship's path. But the messages didn't get through, or they got through and were ignored. Not maliciously, not stupidly, just humanly. The wireless operators on the Titanic were overworked. They weren't employees of the White Star Line, they were employees of the Marconi Company, hired to handle passenger telegrams. And that night, they were behind. Too many messages, too many requests from first class, too much traffic on the line. And so, when the Californian tried to radio a final, urgent warning, icebergs right ahead, the Titanic's wireless operator told them to stop transmitting. Shut up, I'm busy, he said. Because he was, because the ship hadn't hit anything yet. Because the stars were still out, and the sea was still calm, and the passengers still believed that the worst thing that could happen on a voyage was a late arrival. That's how disasters begin. Not with evil, with timing, with assumptions, with noise. There were so many layers between warning and response. The hierarchy of command, the confidence in the ship's strength, the subtle class systems, even in communication, whose messages mattered most, whose voices were urgent. So the ice came, not by surprise, but by negligence, by fatigue, by the thousand small, understandable decisions made by tired men in pressed uniforms who didn't know that this night would be remembered forever. And here's the twist the history books rarely admit. The iceberg wasn't unusual. That stretch of sea, in April, is known for ice. The real anomaly was the ship, so large, so fast, so sure of itself, so convinced that it had nothing to fear from anything that didn't speak English or wear a uniform. The iceberg didn't cause the disaster. It revealed it. When the lookout finally saw the iceberg, it was already too late. Not because it was hidden, not because it appeared out of nowhere, but because physics doesn't care about confidence. Titanic was massive, over 46,000 tons of ambition and ornament, and she was moving fast, roughly 22 knots. That's over 25 miles per hour. For a floating city, that's a sprint. And you can't sprint in the dark and stop on a dime. They tried. The officer on watch shouted the order. Harder starboard. The wheel spun. The engines reversed. The ship shuddered, but the turn was wide. Sluggish, slow. A ship that size, moving that fast, needs time. Needs miles. What it didn't need was pride. And that's what it had in abundance. Captain Edward Smith was experienced. Too experienced, some said. On his final voyage before retirement. Beloved by passengers, trusted by the White Star Line, praised for his calm demeanor. But experience doesn't protect you from momentum. Some accounts say he ignored the ice warnings. Others say he did not, but simply believed the ship could handle it. There were no lifeboat drills, no slowdown, no extra watchmen assigned, just speed and silence. Because at that hour, 11:40 p.m., most of the ship was already asleep, or nearly. Some women were brushing their hair, some men were playing cards. A few insomniacs were still walking the decks, wrapped in furs and thoughts. Then came the jolt, not a crash, a scrape, like the ship had reached out and touched something it shouldn't have. And in that moment, everything changed. Below deck, ice sliced through the starboard side. 5 compartments flooded. The ship could stay afloat with 4, not 5, not this. And still took over half an hour for the full realization to spread. People wandered the corridors in slippers, asked questions with polite voices, waited for someone to tell them where to go, because they'd been told this ship was unsinkable. And when you believe in something that hard, it doesn't die quickly. It dies in stages, in whispers, in hesitation. By the time the crew began loading lifeboats, the bow was already dipping. The water was already in the linen closets, and no amount of rank or reason or uniformed calm could undo the speed of that hour. That's the irony, isn't it? The iceberg didn't break the Titanic. The turn did. Too slow, too late, too human. The Titanic was a marvel of engineering, of aesthetics, of ambition dressed up like comfort. But underneath the wood paneling and the silk curtains, the Titanic had flaws. Not mythical ones, mechanical ones. Design decisions made not for safety, but for style, for prestige, for pride. Her watertight compartments weren't truly watertight. They didn't extend high enough. Each bulkhead rose only part way up the hull, like a series of half-drawn curtains, meant to slow flooding, not stop it. So when the water breached 5 compartments, it didn't stay put. It sloshed over the top deck by deck-like wine spilling down a staircase. The ship sank not vertically, but diagonally, dragged down compartment by compartment, and once the bow dipped below the sea, the weight of water became destiny. There were other issues. The steel used in the hull strong, yes, but brittle in freezing temperatures. The rivets, many of them made from substandard iron, pounded into place by overworked hands in Belfast shipyards, corners cut, deadlines met, because speed and spectacle sold tickets. Titanic was never designed for an emergency. There were no public address systems, no clear evacuation plans. Lifeboats were lowered by crew who had never practiced trying to decipher ropes in the dark. Some boats stuck, some tilted, some didn't lower until shouted into motion. The ship had 4 enormous funnels. Only 3 worked. The 4th was added for aesthetics, for balance, for grandeur. It belched harmless steam, a theatrical exhalation, but it gave the impression of even more power, more symmetry, more invincibility. It looked perfect. And that was the problem. Because perfection doesn't plan for failure. It assumes obedience from the ocean, from the cold, from the future. But nature isn't obedient. It's ancient, it's patient, and it has no use for elegance. So when the iceberg opened the side of the ship like a seam, the Titanic bled not just water, but the illusion of control. You could see it in the officers' eyes, in the way they spoke in half sentences, in the way they moved faster than they had 2 hours earlier, their boots slapping louder now. They weren't guiding a ship anymore. They were guiding a sinking metaphor, a floating cathedral of what people wanted to believe about the 20th century. That progress could outrun fate, that wealth could outlast the cold, that the right wallpaper could stop the sea. But the sea doesn't care for wallpaper, and neither does steel when it snaps. Faith can be beautiful. It can keep us steady in storms. It can lend meaning to grief. It can offer light when everything else has failed. But faith, misapplied faith in the wrong thing, and be deadly. And aboard the Titanic, faith was misplaced not just in steel or in speed, but in the idea that the world was too orderly to allow for chaos. The ship was a marvel, yes, but it was also a monument to human hierarchy. Designed with the confidence of an empire that thought it had tamed danger, and packaged that confidence in velvet and porcelain. But beneath the decor, there was a belief even more dangerous than hubris, that tragedy had been engineered out of the world. It hadn't, but people believed it had. They trusted the ship. They trusted the designers. They trusted the manifest with its neat rows and class assignments, as if your location on a list could save you when the water came. Some passengers went back to their cabins after the iceberg hit. They thought it would be handled, that the issue was someone else's problem, that they'd be called when it was time, that someone, somewhere, was in charge. And someone was. But no one knew everything. Not the captain, not the crew, not the architects in London or the engineers in Belfast. Each person had only a piece, and none of those pieces were enough. That's what made it all fall apart, not villainy, not sabotage, not nature red in tooth and claw, but 1,000 small acts of mistaken trust, believing the cold couldn't kill so quickly, believing people would fill the lifeboats in an orderly fashion, believing the ship could stay afloat until morning, believing that, because something had never happened before, it wouldn't happen now. This is the quiet tragedy at the heart of the Titanic, that the greatest ship ever built didn't go down because people were evil. It went down because they were sure they were right. and they weren't. That kind of faith doesn't look dangerous. It looks calm. It looks composed. It looks like people sipping tea as the Atlantic rises past their knees. It looks like an officer saying, "Everything is under control." It looks like a woman asking if she should bring her pearls. It looks like a ship that doesn't slow down until it breaks. After it happened, after the water, after the silence, after the world woke up to what the ocean had taken, we began to speak of the iceberg as if it had chosen them, as if it had waited, as if the cold had been watching the ship approach with some ancient grudge, ready to unwrite the future in a single, elegant wound. We do this because we need a villain, and ice is a good one. Cold, impersonal, old. We like to imagine it floating toward the Titanic like fate made solid. But the truth is, it was just there, a remnant of a glacier calved months earlier from somewhere in Greenland. It had no motive, no memory, no plan. It drifted, as icebergs do, on the Labrador Current, carried by wind, by tide, by nothing personal. It was a fragment of something much older than ships, older than maps, older than the kind of pride that wears cufflinks. And it was seen, not in time, but still seen, which means it was avoidable, which means we didn't need to make it mean anything. But we did, because if the iceberg is just ice, then the tragedy is just us. Just a story about how we built something too big, trusted it too much, sailed it too fast, and prepared for nothing. But if the iceberg is a symbol, then we can make it into a lesson. We can name it pride. We can call it punishment. We can place it at the climax of a film and watch as everything else falls away, and feel, for a moment, that we understand something vast. But we don't, not really, because the iceberg didn't aim. The iceberg didn't curse. The iceberg didn't know the name of the ship. It simply was, and that's the hardest part to accept, that the end came not because the world is cruel, but because we are fragile, because we thought we had time, because we mistook calm for safety, size for permanence, beauty for immunity, and the iceberg, uncaring, drifted on, back into the sea, back into myth, back into the place where we put all the things that remind us of how quickly everything can change. It wasn't the villain, it was the mirror, and we didn't like what we saw. Let's pretend, not for drama, not for spectacle, but for intimacy. Let's say you were there, on the morning of April 10th, 1912. Let's say you board the Titanic not as you are now, with your phone in your hand and your knowledge of everything to come, but as someone of that world. A version of yourself you don't quite recognize. A little more trusting, a little more buttoned up, a little more optimistic, maybe. You step onto the gangway in Southampton. You feel the wood under your shoes. Hear the gulls above, the shouts of dock workers, the strange, almost holy hush of a ship, so massive it doesn't seem to move even as it swallows people whole. You're not in first class. That's too easy. Maybe you're in second. You've saved for this. Not forever, but long enough. You have a job waiting in America, or a cousin, or no one at all. But the thought of a different city and clean streets and less rain has kept you going for months. Your cabin is small, neat. The bed is stiff but clean. There's a porthole which feels extravagant. You tell yourself you'll write a letter home the first night, but you never quite get around to it. You explore the ship slowly. You don't want to seem impressed, though you are. You pass through the reading room, the smoking lounge. The staircase is carved like something from a different century. You see the first-class passengers, elegant and untouchable, like actors in a silent film. You don't resent them, not really. They just live in a different part of the script. The days pass in quiet routine. You wake early. You eat plain but decent meals. You talk to a stranger about where to find the best coffee in New York. You sleep badly, not because you're afraid, but because the ship creaks in unfamiliar ways, and your mind hasn't yet made peace with the motion. Then comes April 14th. The sea is like black silk. The stars are impossible. The cold is sharp, but you've been colder. You're in bed when the jolt comes. It's small, barely a whisper, like the ship is clearing its throat. You sit up, you wait, you hear voices in the hallway. Someone laughs. Someone knocks on the door across from yours and says, "It's nothing." You believe them. Of course you do. Why wouldn't you? No one runs. No one shouts. No one says, "Get your coat and don't look back." And so you lie there, suspended in a moment that hasn't broken yet. You don't know the water is already coming. You don't know the ship has begun to die. You don't know that somewhere above you, a man is lighting his last cigarette. You just wait. And in that waiting, you are more human than you've ever been. Because the future hasn't arrived yet. Because the end still looks like sleep. The hallway is colder now. That's the first thing you notice. A breeze, not from a window, but from the ship itself. If it's breathing differently, shallow, stressed, something is wrong, but no one says so. You open your door. People are beginning to gather. Not panicked, curious, like neighbors in a building when the power flickers. Some are still in slippers. One woman has curlers in her hair. A man jokes that he ordered ice water, but this is ridiculous. Someone in a steward's uniform walks past quickly. Too quickly, he's not looking at you. You call out, he doesn't answer. The air smells different now. Less like wood polish, more like metal and damp wool. You move up a deck. There's more noise. Still no shouting. Just the sound of steps. Of doors opening and closing. A child crying once, briefly. You start to feel underdressed, though you're not sure why. A man you don't know says, "It's just a precaution. We'll be back in bed in an hour." Another woman holds her Bible like it's a passport. Then you see a crew member carrying life jackets, not passing them out, just carrying them. You ask again what's happening, and he says, "We've had a bit of a bump. Go to the boat deck, please." You ask if you should take your things. He doesn't answer. So you grab your coat, your shoes, that letter you started and never finished. You think about your suitcase, but it's too heavy. You climb the stairs. More people now. Some laughing nervously, some arguing, some standing still. A man in a tuxedo insists he needs his overcoat, as if the ship will wait. You reach the deck, and suddenly, there it is, the sea. You didn't expect it to be so quiet. The night is vast, cold, beautiful, in a way that feels insulting. And then you hear it. The sound of a lifeboat lowering. The sound of a woman refusing to get in without her husband. The sound of an officer shouting, "Numbers 35, 40, no more." You realize this isn't a drill. This isn't temporary. This isn't being handled. This is it. And in that moment, your body makes a decision before your mind does. You step forward, not because you know what to do, but because no one else does either. The people who were supposed to have answers are now holding ropes with shaking hands. The men in uniforms are arguing quietly. There is no map for this, no plan you've been given, no alarm, just a wide black sky and the feeling that your story has been interrupted mid-sentence. You reach for someone's hand. You don't know them. They don't let go. It doesn't look like safety. That's your first impression of the lifeboat. It looks small, wooden, exposed, like something meant for rowers in a calm lake. Not this sea, which has begun to feel like a mouth slowly opening. The boat sways as people are helped in. It creaks. One man asks if it will tip. Another says nothing and gets in anyway. An officer shouts, "Women and children first." You hesitate. Not because you want to be brave, because you don't want to be foolish. Because the ship is still here, still solid beneath your feet, still glowing with light, still humming with the promise of this can't be happening. The man beside you says, "It's unsinkable, remember." You nod, because it's easier than arguing. But the lifeboat is half full, and the officer is looking at you now. Not just you, all of you. "Get in," he says. And suddenly, it's a question you're not ready for. Do you stay with what you know, or step into what you don't? There are people behind you, watching, waiting. Their eyes say, "If you go, we'll go." If you don't, you look back at the ship, at the warm corridors, at the portholes, at the smokestacks, quiet now, at the deck chairs, still aligned like nothing's wrong. And then you look down, at the boat, at the hands reaching up to help, at the water darker than anything you've ever seen, and somehow you move. Not with grace, not with confidence, just with necessity. You lower yourself into the boat. The wood creaks beneath you. Someone sits beside you. She's crying, quietly. You offer your coat. She doesn't take it, but she nods. And then, slowly, the rope's grown, and the ship begins to rise above you. You hadn't realized how tall it was. You hadn't realized how much light it gave off. You hadn't realized how it looked from below, like a cathedral leaning forward into the void. The sea kisses your shoes. The boat hits the water. Someone starts to row, and the ship begins to drift away, not because it moves, but because you do. For the first time, you're separate from it. You watch it now the way you watch a house you once lived in, and something inside you begins to shake. Not from cold, not from fear, from knowing this was the right choice. And still, you don't feel lucky. Not yet. The oars are silent, mostly. A few splash too hard. The man rowing across from you doesn't look up. He just pulls. Again, as if the rhythm might keep him from thinking. You're drifting, not far, not fast, just away. From the light, from the warmth, from the part of the ship where your bag still rests under the bed, from the tea you didn't finish, from the conversation you meant to continue tomorrow. And then you hear it, not all at once. First, a groan, low, metallic, then a pop sharp, startling, like something giving up. Then shouts, from above, from the deck, people calling names, people crying out to no one. The ship is tilting now. You can see it. You can feel it. One of the funnels leans just slightly, just enough to change the shape of everything. And then the lights flicker, only for a second, but you feel the boat stiffen around you. Everyone does. The quiet tightens, and then the screaming begins. Not like in the stories, not in a wave. It starts as disbelief. Raised voices, confused shouts, then panic, then roar. You've never heard sound like this. It's the sound of understanding arriving all at once in 1,000 hearts. The sound of people learning that no one is coming for them yet. The sound of shoes on steel. The sound of a mother screaming a child's name like it might be a spell. Someone in your boat covers their ears. Someone else begins to pray. You stare, not at the people, but at the ship, because it doesn't seem possible. It's still there, still whole, still too big to die. And yet, The bow is gone now. Submerged, the stern is rising. One of the officers in your boat whispers, "My God." You don't remember grabbing someone's hand, but you did. You don't remember if it's yours that's shaking, but it is. And you realize this is the moment, the one no one ever prepares you for. The moment where you stop believing it can be fixed, where you stop hoping for rewind and start counting what you've lost. Even though it isn't over yet, even though the ship is still visible, even though technically you're safe, you are, in that instant, already grieving. Not just the people, not just the ship, but something inside yourself, a trust, a belief, a part of you that didn't think the world could end on a calm night under a sky full of stars. And still, it does. There is a point not marked by any sound, not announced by the sky or sea when you stop turning round. When the ship fades not into the horizon, but into something worse. Memory. The Titanic is still there, still breaking, still slipping beneath the surface. But your body cold, heavy, exhausted, won't let you watch anymore. Your eyes sting from salt and wind. Your neck aches from turning. Your stomach knots every time someone else says a name you recognize. So you face forward, not because it feels right, because looking back now hurts. The silence has returned, mostly, not because the noise has ended, but because it's grown distant, muffled by space, by disbelief, by distance you didn't ask for and can't undo. Someone in the boat whispers, "We should go back," but no one moves. Not because they don't care, because they're afraid, because they saw what the water did to the ship, because they don't know if the boat can hold any more, because some of them have children in their arms now, and because part of them is still expecting anyone to fix it. But no one does. You sit there, fingers numb, watching frost gather on the edges of the oarlock. The cold settles into you like a language you're just beginning to learn. You think of strange things, the last meal you ate, the letter you didn't send, the book under your pillow. You think of how long it took the ship to die, how beautiful it looked while doing so, and you wonder, will that be what people remember? The beauty or the mistake, the music or the silence after? You want to ask someone, but your voice doesn't feel like it belongs here anymore. And even if it did, what would you say? What could you ask? So instead, you wait, wrapped in wet wool and unfinished thoughts, facing a future that hasn't quite arrived, carried forward by water, by grief, by a boat that still rocks with the weight of survival. You stop looking back, not because it's over, but because it never will be. Dawn didn't arrive the way they said it would. It wasn't golden. It wasn't warm. It crept across the water in grey layers, like someone drawing the curtain on a room they no longer wanted to see. The sky was the color of tin, the sea still glass. A morning that looked more like an autopsy than a rebirth. You were still in the boat, stiff, quiet, awake, but not really present. Someone pointed, and there it was, a shape on the horizon, low, steady, with smoke that meant fire, and fire that meant life. The RMS Carpathia, sent by the pulse of a wireless signal, a flare of Morse code, shot through the dark like a prayer in static. You didn't cheer, no one did, because relief, after this much silence, doesn't sound like joy. It sounds like breathing again for the first time in hours. It sounds like a mother whispering we made it into the ear of a child who never woke up. It sounds like a man saying his wife's name once, softly, then never again. They began lifting people from the lifeboats. Not quickly, not efficiently, but carefully, because bodies moved differently now. They were wet, cold, bruised in ways no one could see. Some could walk, most couldn't. Many were wrapped in blankets that felt like apologies. You were handed up. Your knees didn't work. You fell. Someone caught you. They didn't ask your name. Not yet. They handed you tea that scalded your palms. But you drank it anyway, because it was warm, because it was real. You sat down on the deck and looked around. Faces you didn't know yesterday were now your family. One woman wept, but quietly. A child, perhaps 4 or 5, reached into her pocket and found nothing. And the sea, which had held you all night, had gone still again. You didn't ask about the others. Not yet. You didn't ask who had been found, because you knew, because the lifeboats were counted, and the numbers were final. The Carpathia didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a confession. The world you left had ended. And this ship, this borrowed, bustling, ordinary ship, was the beginning of a different one. Not better, not worse, just changed. Because once you've seen the water take what it wants, you don't trust the sky the same way. By the time the Carpathia reached New York, the story had already arrived. Not the truth, just the shape of it. Newspapers printed half names, half facts, guesses dressed up as headlines. Telegrams flickered across continents. The Titanic, unsinkable, had sunk, but no one knew how, or why, or who had survived. And so the city waited. The docks were lined with reporters, relatives, onlookers. Some clutched photographs, some carried flowers, some brought questions sharpened like knives. And then the ship appeared. Small, grey, unremarkable. Not the Titanic, just a vessel carrying survivors. You didn't want to disembark, not because you weren't grateful, but because stepping off that gangway meant stepping into a world that hadn't lived it. A world that didn't know the difference between surviving and being saved. They tried to help. There were blankets, hotels, hospitals, priests. People asked you to speak, to tell what happened. But how do you explain that the worst part wasn't the sinking? It was the waiting. The sound of voices fading in the dark. The moment when the ship, still lit, began to tilt toward a silence no one was ready to name. You were given a name tag, a form, a place to go. But no one told you how to walk without holding on to something. No one warned you that stairs would feel wrong, that heat would feel suspicious, that beds would feel like boats. Some survivors couldn't speak at all. A woman sat on the curb outside the Cunard building for 2 hours, holding her husband's coat. He hadn't survived. She never moved, just sat there, as if someone had pressed pause on her life. Others spoke too much. Their stories spilled out like open wounds. They didn't match. Not always. Some said the ship broke in half. Some said it went down whole. Some said the band played nearer, my God, to thee. Some swore it was autumn. The truth was slippery, frayed by memory and cold and fear. But everyone agreed on one thing. The sky was full of stars, so bright, so still, as if the heavens had been watching, not rescuing, just witnessing. And that, maybe, is the loneliest thing of all. To survive and realize that the sky never flinched, that the world didn't stop, that people still laughed and argued and bought bread, that the tragedy you carry in your bones is just Tuesday, and so you breathe, you walk, you answer when someone calls your name. But part of you stays out there, in the boat, in the cold, in the starlight, where nothing made sense and everything was true. Back in England, back in Ireland, back in tiny villages whose names don't appear on most maps, there were letters, not from the sea, from before, from Southampton, posted on April 10th. From Queenstown, sent on the 11th. From mid-ocean, slipped into mailbags and carried by the Titanic's own post clerks, who sorted them by lamplight, even after the iceberg struck. Some made it off, most didn't, but just a few arrived. Weeks later, too late, they were opened by hands already grieving. A mother in Cork received a card from her daughter. "We are having tea in the second-class saloon. Everyone is lovely." The girl's name would be printed a week later among the missing. She was 17. A man in Liverpool received a letter from his brother, scrawled on white Star Line stationery. "The ship is grand, truly." By the time he read it, the ship was gone. One woman who had wept for days thinking her cousin was lost received a note in her cousin's unmistakable hand. "I've just seen the ocean for the first time. It smells like cold iron." The cousin had survived. She hadn't known. The post had taken its time. The letters became something sacred. Read and reread. Stained with tears, folded along soft edges, tucked into drawers. They weren't dramatic. They didn't describe the sinking. They didn't scream. They were normal. And that's what made them cruel. Because they froze the past in amber, they reminded the living of the versions of themselves that still believed the ship would dock, that still believed in safe arrivals, in plans, in Tuesday morning. Some of those letters are now in museums, encased in glass, lit from above, unfolded like scripture, and some still live in boxes beneath beds, in tin containers on bookshelves, in envelopes passed down like heirlooms. They are the opposite of headlines. They don't explain, they don't analyze, they don't argue about rivets or speed or culpability. They just are. A final breath, a small voice, a sentence that stops short of disaster. And in that space between word and wave you can still hear them, not calling for help, not saying goodbye, just saying, "I'm here." And maybe that's what we all want. To be remembered not for how we left, but for how we lived. In the months after the sinking, the headlines moved on. But the women didn't. Not right away. Not quietly. Not this time. They were supposed to mourn with grace, to grieve in lace and soft voices, to be sad but not political, to remember without asking questions. Instead, they did something else. They testified. They stood in front of Senate committees and shipping boards and rows of unsympathetic men in polished shoes and said, "There weren't enough lifeboats," they said. "We were locked below," they said. "The officers were unprepared. The stewards vanished. The crew didn't know how to lower the boats." They were women who had lost husbands, children, entire futures. And still they stood. Margaret Brown later mythologized as the unsinkable Molly didn't wear defiance like a performance. She wore it like a duty. She raised funds for destitute survivors. She demanded accountability. She refused to let anyone forget what had happened in the dark. She wasn't alone. A chorus of women from all classes wrote letters to newspapers, organized memorials, called out the names of companies and captains who had traded human lives for luxury and speed. And the world listened briefly. The British and American inquiries brought out charts and experts and surviving officers. There were apologies, policy changes, requirements for more lifeboats on passenger ships, radio regulations, but the deepest truths, the ones spoken in quiet testimonies by women whose lives had split in half, those faded more quickly. People forget that second-class women had to wait hours in wet skirts for a place on deck, that third-class mothers were told, "Just stay put," that some women stepped off lifeboats into cities where their accents marked them as foreign, unwelcome, unlucky. There was a second silence after the first one, not of tragedy, but of inconvenience. Their grief didn't fit the narrative. It was messy, angry, long. It lasted longer than the sympathy window, and so most of them stopped talking, went back to what was expected, but not before leaving a paper trail of resistance. Letters, interviews, courtroom statements, little acts of defiance in corset seams and calloused hands. You won't find most of their names in history books, but they were there, holding infants in lifeboats, handing out biscuits on the Carpathia, writing to newspapers in neat, ink-stained cursive. They refused to be footnotes. They survived, and then they testified. The Titanic went down once, but it sank again and again in headlines, in memories, in boardrooms, in nightmares. The physical ship vanished beneath the sea at 2:20 in the morning, but its ghost didn't stay down. It haunted courtrooms. It haunted dreams. It haunted an entire century. For months afterward, every ship was compared to it. Lifeboats sufficient, wireless equipment tested, crew trained, passengers stepped aboard with questions they never used to ask. And yet, ships still sank. Warnings were still ignored. History, it turns out, isn't a cure, it's a mirror. And when we don't like the reflection, we turn away. The Titanic became a symbol so quickly that people stopped asking what it really meant. It became a shorthand for arrogance, for hubris, for human error on a grand scale. But it was also something else. It was ordinary, a floating society that mirrored the one on land, divided by class, structured by gender, propped up by labor most passengers never saw. It sank, in part, because that structure worked too well. People followed orders. People stayed in their lanes. People waited their turn. People believed the men in charge. And when it fell apart, it did so in layers, like a civilization unraveling at sea. Years later, when the wreck was found in 1985, 2 miles down, it wasn't whole. It was broken, split in two. As if, even in death, the ship couldn't decide what kind of story it wanted to tell. Some were disappointed by the discovery. It didn't look majestic. It looked ruined, twisted, human. But maybe that's the truest version. Not the paintings, not the movies, not the myth, but the rusting bones of a dream that was never built to float forever. Because no matter how carefully we construct our futures, no matter how beautiful the architecture or how strong the promises, everything we make carries the risk of ending. And sometimes the ending is not the fire or the fury. Sometimes it's ice, quiet, unfeeling, simple, final, long after the rescue, long after the headlines faded and the sea returned to being just water again. There were chairs, empty ones, at kitchen tables, in meeting rooms, on porches where people once read the paper while sipping tea, in churches where a pew stayed half filled for the rest of the season. Every survivor came back to a seat someone else didn't fill, and they noticed, even when no one said anything. Especially then, it wasn't always a dramatic loss. Sometimes it was subtle. A neighbor who never returned, a cousin who had been too shy to board the boat with you, and now lived only in letters from home. A stranger you'd spoken to for 10 minutes on the promenade, decked just long enough to like them, just long enough to wonder if they'd made it. Their absence followed you. Not loudly, not publicly, just persistently. You'd reach for a second plate without thinking. You'd leave space on a bench. You'd pause, waiting for a reply you'd forgotten would never come. The world didn't call it grief, not always. Sometimes it was just bad nerves. Sometimes exhaustion. Sometimes it was nothing at all. because saying you missed someone you barely knew didn't seem acceptable. But loss doesn't need permission, and the chairs don't care who you were to the person who's gone. They just stay empty, and in that emptiness, the story returns, quietly, uninvited, while you're folding laundry, while you're stirring tea, while you're sitting on a train platform in a different country, watching strangers pass and wondering which ones carry lifeboat-shaped shadows in their eyes. Because that's the part no one prepares you for. The normal, the endless, echoing normal of a life that keeps moving forward without everyone in it. Titanic didn't just sink in the Atlantic. It sank into living rooms, into rituals, into silences so deep they couldn't be filled by anything but time and, even then, only partially. You begin to build around the empty chair. You place flowers beside it. You stop offering it to guests. You don't explain, because how do you explain that a ship can still take something from you, even years later? That a part of you is still out there, bobbing in the dark. That some people leave your life not by walking away, but by slipping under, and all you have left is a chair, and the memory of the last time it was warm. They never wrote it down, not in the inquiries, not in the testimonies, but many survivors, when they did speak, if they spoke, mentioned it. The smell, not of the sea, not of salt, but of cold. A kind of scent that lives in the back of the throat, metallic and thin, like wet iron or an old coin left in your mouth too long. It returned in dreams, years later, sometimes decades, long after they'd remarried, rebuilt, repainted the part of their lives that had rusted in April of 1912. It came back, the water, not in waves, but in sensation. They would wake to dry sheets, dry air, a steady ceiling. And yet somewhere in their lungs, the cold was still there. You might have expected panic, but what many described instead was weight, a heaviness behind the eyes, a pressure in the chest, a slowness in the bones that didn't always lift by morning. It wasn't the drowning they remembered. It was the waiting, the floating, the feeling of knowing the ship was gone but hearing voices anyway. That kind of memory doesn't knock on the door politely. It slips under, through cracks, through weather, through stillness. One man claimed he couldn't swim in lakes for the rest of his life, not because he was afraid, but because still water made him feel watched. Another refused to ride escalators. He said they reminded him of the slow descent of the deck beneath his feet. Children who survived often didn't recall the night itself, but they remembered their parents' hands, too tight, or suddenly not there. And some grew up with that cold buried in their blood, inherited, unspoken. Survival changes the way time moves. It slows it down in strange places. You find yourself staring at puddles longer than you should. You flinch when ice cracks in a glass of water. You listen to the silence between fairy announcements with too much attention. It's not trauma, exactly. It's echo. The echo of cold metal. The echo of violins in water. The echo of something vast and final that you survived, but didn't escape. You breathe, you speak, you live. But sometimes, when the room is dark and the blanket's too quiet, you smell cold again, and you remember the ship is still down there, and part of you is, too. There are people who went on to live entire lives after the Titanic. Long, full, successful lives. They became teachers, parents, artists, soldiers. They ran shops. They wrote books. They sat in movie theaters decades later, watching dramatizations of a night they didn't need anyone to explain to them. And yet, they carried something. Something no one else could quite name. Not survivor's guilt, exactly. Not trauma in the medical sense. Just a presence. a ship-shaped shadow inside the heart. Because when you live through something that massive, that sudden, that permanent, it becomes part of your architecture. You learn to smile around it. You learn to decorate it. You might even laugh again, fully, loudly, beautifully. But deep inside, there is a keel, a weight, a sense of balance forever altered. They said it about many survivors. There's something in their eyes, not haunted, just distant, like they were always watching something else in the background, listening for a sound that wasn't there, waiting for the floor to tilt again. They married people who never knew the cold. They raised children who never asked about April. They built routines, grocery lists, Tuesday dinners. But the ship stayed. In the way they packed for trips. In the way they hesitated at the edge of silence. In the way they said, "I'll be back soon," and meant it a little harder than most. You might never notice it, but if you sat with them, quietly, on a winter's night, if the wind knocked just once too hard against the window-paned seat, just for a moment, the way they froze, the way they steadied the cup before it tipped, the way they looked at water as if remembering how deep it can become when it wants to, you wouldn't ask, and they wouldn't offer. But in that stillness, in that flicker of remembering, you'd understand. They survived the sinking, but part of them never came ashore. We remember some of them, the rich, the famous, the ones immortalized in films and books and plaques with gold lettering. Captain Edward Smith, who went down with his ship. Thomas Andrews, the architect, seen calmly helping women into lifeboats. The bandleader Wallace Hartley, whose final notes became legend. But most of them, over 1,000, have names that never made it beyond a line on a manifest. Steerage passengers, third class, workers below deck whose job titles disappeared faster than their bodies. There were 8 Chinese men aboard the Titanic. 6 survived. They were denied entry to the United States under the Chinese Exclusion Act, deported almost immediately, their stories erased, distorted, rewritten as footnotes of suspicion. Only recently have researchers begun to reclaim their names, their lives, their truth. There were hundreds of Irish emigrants, whole families trying to get to New York, Boston, Chicago, women in shawls with suitcases full of letters, boys named Patrick and girls named Mary, all of whom thought the world was about to open. Most of them never reached the upper decks. Most were told to wait, and most were never found. Their names live on in quiet places, in local memorials carved with more love than budget, in archives with smudged ink and soft-spined ledgers, in descendants who ask questions at libraries, trying to piece together the shape of a Gradacole's journey, or a great-grandmother's missing sister. And in the air, still, if you listen long enough, we carry them in silence, because sometimes silence is all that's left, not because we forgot, but because we remember without always knowing how to say so. There's something holy in a name, even when it's only whispered, even when the person it belonged to was never photographed, never famous, never expected to leave a mark. Even then, especially then, it matters. Because when the sea took the Titanic, it didn't just take people, it took stories. It took the best and worst of what we were building. And when we say the ship's name now, over a century later, what we're really doing is asking a question: who gets remembered? And if they don't, what does that mean for us? The Titanic never really left. It sits beneath 2.5 miles of ocean, yes, split, rusting, slowly dissolving into the darkness of time. But above the water a pirate lingers, in the metaphors we reach for, in the way we talk about hubris, in every story that begins with "they said it couldn't happen." Titanic has become a shorthand for downfall, for the quiet edge before catastrophe, for what happens when human confidence meets the immovable cold. We see it in headlines about unsinkable economies that sink anyway, in the quiet panic of engineers at machines they can't quite control, in leaders who smile at cameras as something groans beneath them. The ship has become a ghost, not of failure, but of the moment before failure, that strange hush before it all goes wrong. And we are haunted, still, not just by the deaths but by the resemblance, because we recognize ourselves in the passengers sipping champagne, in the men who delayed lifeboat drills, in the officers who didn't want to cause a scene. We see our own systems, the ones we insist are too big to fall, to advance to fail, and we wonder, what if this is our Titanic? What if we are already in the quiet part, the still part, the stars above the ocean part? Titanic doesn't just warn us, it accuses us. It holds up a mirror, not to the past, but to our present, and it asks softly, bitterly, without ever raising its voice, have you learned anything? Because if we haven't, if we are still racing forward, still cutting corners, still designing beautiful things that aren't built to last, then maybe we are not survivors. Maybe we are just passengers who haven't heard the iceberg yet. You've heard the story, that as the Titanic tilted, as panic bloomed like frost across every deck, the band played, that they gathered near the grand staircase, or on the boat deck, or wherever people would listen, that they stood with instruments already damped from the air and performed something no one had asked for. Not a dirge, not a hymn, just music. No one's sure which song was last. Some say it was Nearer, my God, to Thee. Others say Autumn. It doesn't matter, because what they played wasn't just melody. It was a gesture, a protest, maybe, against the chaos. A final thread of meaning in a night unraveling too fast. They weren't told to play. They weren't asked to comfort. They weren't required to die, but they stayed. One violin, one cello, one moment of coherence in the cold. And what's strange, what still makes the heart pauses that passengers remembered, even in shock, even in grief, even years later, people who lost everything remembered the sound. They described it as steady, gentle, sad, but not hopeless. Like the ship, in its last breath, had decided to leave behind something beautiful. And the musicians, ordinary men in rented uniforms, gave their lives doing something no one will ever fully understand. They played so others could breathe slower, so others could step into lifeboats with dignity, so the world would know that even in catastrophe there had been grace. No one awarded them medals, no one built them statues right away. They were listed among the dead, same as everyone else. But we remember them, because they didn't save themselves. They saved the silence. And that is a kind of heroism that doesn't ask to be seen, only heard, only once, only when it matters most. When the Titanic slipped beneath the Atlantic, the lights were still burning. Not all of them, not in every hallway or cabin, but enough to see by, enough to be remembered. Accounts from survivors speak of something eerie and gentle, a ship glowing even as it died, a final defiance against the dark. The engineers did that, men you've never heard of, men who never made it above deck, who stayed in the engine rooms, the boiler rooms, the turbine chambers, who knew what was happening and stayed anyway. They weren't saints, they were workers, paid in coin, not praise. Most of them were from Belfast, or Liverpool, or somewhere in between. Hard hands, plain voices, thick coats, and they kept the lights on, even as the water rushed in, even as the bulkheads groaned, even as they must have known must have known there were no lifeboats waiting for them. They did it because people needed to see. Because panic in the dark is different. Because fear grows when shadows grow. And so they kept the current flowing, managed the steam, stoked what fires were left, held back the sea, minute by precious minute. You didn't see them in the movies. They don't get monologues. But without them, no one would have found the deck. No one would have seen the lifeboats. No one would have remembered anything at all. That's how some lives are spent. Not in fame, but in function. Not in speech, but in silence. Not because someone told you to, because someone needed you to. And when the final moments came, when the stern rose and the ship's spine arched against the sky, those lights flickered, then vanished. Not violently, not all at once, just out, one by one, like stars being unmade. And still, for those watching from the boats, from the sea, from the edge of belief, that glow became memory. Proof that even the darkest night is not without its lanterns. Proof that someone, somewhere, stayed behind for you, so you could see and survive. There was a moment brief, terrible, suspended in frost when the noise stopped. After the final scream, after the last splash, after the last prayer whispered into the wind. The silence that followed the sinking wasn't like the silence of a quiet room or a still night. It was a vacuum, a silence that meant something. Because what had come before, panic, cries, instructions, chaos at least, meant there were people, alive, present, fighting. But then, nothing. For a minute, perhaps two, the only sounds were the creak of lifeboats and the breath of those still afloat. The sea returned to calm. The stars remained indifferent, and those left in the boats, clutching strangers, clutching oars, clutching the air itself, were left with the unbearable sound of a world that had just swallowed over 1,500 souls without a trace. Some began to cry, not for the first time, but in a different key. Not panic now, grief. Others whispered names under their breath. Some closed their eyes and prayed for the silence to end. Because silence, at that depth of loss, becomes something almost physical. It presses. It wraps around you like a wet shroud. One woman said later that it was the worst part of all. Not the screams, not the sinking, but the stillness afterward. Because it made you feel like you were the last person left on earth. Some began to sing, just a few voices, soft and uneven, clinging to a hymn that half the boat remembered and half the boat couldn't finish. It didn't matter. It wasn't about the song. It was about not being alone in the quiet. It was about calling into the dark and hearing something, anything answer back. Even a single voice, even your own. And then, slowly, gently, the world began to make sound again. Water lapping, wood settling. A child asking if it was over. It was, but that silence never left them. It would find them again in empty rooms, in dreams, in moments of sudden stillness, years later, in kitchens or on trains or standing in doorways for no reason at all. It would whisper back, you were there, and so were they, and for one breathless starlit moment, the world was too quiet to forget. Not everything went down with the Titanic. Some things floated. Some were found days, even weeks later, washed up on distant shores or drifting alone in the Atlantic like fragments of a dream that had forgotten how to end. A deck chair, bleached by salt and sun, a violin case, a woman's boot, a piece of carved oak paneling, part of the first-class smoking lounge, found bobbing in the sea like a ghost of luxury. A life jacket with no name attached. These objects, these orphans of tragedy, became relics. People gathered them, preserved them, built museums around them, not because they were particularly useful, but because they proved something had been there, that the ship wasn't just a story, that it had touched the world, that it had bled into it. There are letters still in circulation, their ink warped by water, menus from the last dinner served in the first-class saloon, a pocket watch stopped at 2:20 a.m. Each of these carries a strange kind of intimacy. They're not just evidence, they're leftovers. Reminders that even in disaster, the world doesn't take everything, that some things survive not whole, not unchanged, but present. And for some people, these fragments were all they got back. No body, no goodbye. Just a postcard returned months later. Just a hat. Just a name tag. Imagine holding that. Imagine lifting a suitcase from a pile and recognizing the initials, and realizing that's all that's left of a person you loved. The grief lives in that, in the physical, in the small, because loss isn't always an explosion. Sometimes it's a teacup, a blanket, a ticket stub, and in those items, kept and passed down, displayed or hidden, the Titanic still speaks, not in grand tragedy, but in the gentle, awful language of objects unclaimed, because the sea, for all its power, can't keep everything, and what floats back to us, what endures, isn't always the strongest, just the most stubborn, just the most loved, just the things that knew how to wait. Most people didn't get to say it. Goodbye, not really. Not the kind that sticks. Not the kind you write on the back of an envelope or whisper into a coat collar at a train station. Not the kind that feels like closing a door gently, like folding a memory in half and placing it on a shelf. The Titanic didn't allow for those. It ended things mid-thought, mid-conversation, mid-plan. A father waving from the deck, not knowing it would be the last time. A sister running down a corridor, hoping to find her brother before the lifeboats were gone. A fiancé holding hands until an officer said women only, and they let go not because they wanted to, but because they thought they'd meet again on another dock, another morning. But they didn't. And the weight of that, of what wasn't said, stayed heavier than grief. Because grief, at least, has shape. Silence doesn't. It lives in the pauses of a sentence. In the breath someone takes before they almost mention him, then stop. In the way a woman sets the table for 3, then adjusts it to 2. There are letters that end too abruptly. There are diary entries that trail off after we board tomorrow. There are telegrams that say, all well, much love, and nothing more. It's not enough. It never is. But it's what people were left with. Half goodbyes, fragments, impressions pressed into fabric in time. And in the decades that followed, those who were left behind created their own endings. They wrote the letters that never got sent. They dreamed conversations where the missing spoke softly, slowly, smiling. They lit candles. They named ships after lost siblings. They stood on beaches and listened to the sea until it sounded like a voice. We do this, all of us. When the world forgets to give us closure, we build our own, not out of vengeance, but out of love. Because if goodbye was stolen, we whisper it anyway. Into pillows, into wind, into the dark. We say it late. We say it trembling, but we say it. Because in the end, what we really want isn't just to remember them. It's to believe they remember us. Thank you for staying with me. I know it's late. I hope wherever you are curled beneath blankets, or drifting off in the glow of your phone, light you felt something tonight. Not just history, but memory. Not just a story, but a quiet connection. If you're still here, Truly thank you. If you enjoyed this kind of storytelling and you'd like to hear more, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. Only if it feels right. Only if it brings you some peace. And if you feel like sharing, let me know where you're listening from, or what time it is. I love imagining the little constellation of lights we all make together, across time zones and stories. But for now, rest easy,